October 12, 1934. Germania Club, Manhattan. A 350-pound enforcer stepped forward to crush one man from Harlem. 5 seconds decided everything. This wasn't rage or ego. It was calculation, pressure, territory. A local boss faced a machine built to dominate New York and walked out alive. So what did Bumpy Johnson do in that room that froze Dutch Schultz's empire? To understand the result, we have to return to the first move, Harlem, 1934, 7:45 in the evening. Lenox Avenue. The wind cut through cheap coats and found skin, and the pavement was slick with rain that had fallen hours ago and never quite dried. The word came down the street faster than any newspaper could print it. Dutch Schultz had sent men to 135th Street to teach a lesson. The lesson involved a tire iron and a bank clerk who worked for St. Clair. 3 men grabbed him walking home from work, dragged him into an alley, and broke both his hands. 1 finger at a time, slow enough that the screaming lasted long enough for people in the buildings above to hear it and understand what it meant. When they were done, they left him there with his fingers bent at angles not supposed to bend, and a message folded in his coat pocket. The message had 3 words written in pencil, pressed hard enough to almost tear the paper. Bumpy Johnson, Germania Club, 9 p.m. A runner brought the message to a bar on Lenox where Bumpy was drinking wine that tasted like old wood and bitter grapes. The runner was 17, skinny, with eyes that had seen too much for his age. He handed Bumpy the folded paper and stepped back like he was afraid it might explode. Bumpy read it once, folded it back up, and set it on the bar next to his wine glass. The runner shifted his weight from foot to foot, waiting for a reaction that did not come. "You know what this is?" Bumpy asked, his voice flat as a blade. "Yes, sir. Mister. Schultz wants you downtown. He wants me, or he ordered me." The runner swallowed hard. He said, "If you do not come, St. Clair's people will keep getting hurt until there is nobody left to run the bank." Bumpy picked up his wine and finished it in 1 swallow. "Tell me what happened to the clerk." "All of it." The runner's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They broke his fingers with a tire iron, started with the left hand, pinky first, worked their way across. He was screaming so loud people 3 floors up heard it. When they finished the left hand, they did the right. 10 fingers. It took them maybe 5 minutes. Then they left him there bleeding and told him to crawl home and tell Mr. St. Clair that this is what happens when people forget who runs this city." Bumpy set his empty glass down and looked at the runner with eyes that showed nothing. "How old are you?" 17. "Have you ever seen someone get their fingers broken before tonight?" "No, sir." "Now you have. Remember what it looked like. Remember what it sounded like. Because that is what Dutch Schultz calls a message. That is how he talks when he wants people to listen." The runner nodded, his face pale. Someone in the back of the bar had put Duke Ellington on the phonograph, and the saxophone cut through the smoke hanging near the ceiling. Bumpy stood up and pulled his coat on, and a man sitting 2 stools down spoke up without looking at him. "You are not really going, are you? That is a trap. Schultz does not want to talk. He wants to make an example." Bumpy buttoned his coat slowly. "I know what he wants." "Then why go send word back that you will meet him on neutral ground, or do not meet him at all? Let him come to you." Bumpy looked at the man like he was explaining arithmetic to a child. "If I do not go, Harlem thinks I am scared. COI. If Harlem thinks I am scared, every small-time punk with a gun will decide I am finished, and they can take what is mine. If I send conditions, Schultz tells everyone I am too afraid to walk into his place, which is the same as not going. So I go. And I go alone. And I walk out. Or I do not. But either way, Harlem will know I did not run." The man shook his head and went back to his drink. Bumpy walked to the door, then stopped and turned back to the runner who was still standing there like he was waiting for more instructions. "You tell St. Clair I am handling this. You tell him to keep his people off the streets tonight. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Nobody makes themselves a target. If Schultz wants to send more messages, I would rather he send them to me than to clerks who cannot defend themselves." "Yes, sir." "What do I tell people about where you are going?" "You tell them I have business downtown, nothing else." The runner left, and Bumpy stood at the bar for another 30 seconds, thinking through the steps the way a chess player thinks through moves before touching a piece. Schultz did not need to talk to him. Schultz wanted to hit St. Clair, and he was using Bumpy as the messenger. Germania was Schultz's territory, a place where Schultz made the rules and controlled every exit. Going alone was the only move because bringing backup would be read as a declaration of war. The bartender, an old man who had been pouring drinks on Lennox since before Prohibition, set another glass of wine in front of Bumpy without being asked. "On the house. You might need it." Bumpy looked at the wine but did not touch it. "You think I am walking into something I cannot walk out of." The bartender wiped down the bar with a rag that had seen better days. "I think Dutch Schultz does not invite people downtown to have polite conversations. I think when he calls your name, it is because he wants to prove something, and proving something usually means someone gets hurt. Then I better make sure it is not me." "How are you going to do that? He has 50 men in that club. You are one man walking in with nothing but your reputation." Bumpy's jaw tightened. "Reputation is all I need, because if I pull a gun, I am dead before I get the safety off. If I fight, I am dead before I land a punch. The only way I walk out of Germania alive is if I make Schultz think twice about what happens if he kills me. And the only way to do that is to walk in there calm enough that he wonders what I know that he does not." The bartender shook his head slowly. "You are betting your life on psychology. I am betting my life on the fact that Dutch Schultz is smart enough to understand that killing me creates more problems than it solves. He wants Harlem to fall in line. If he kills me, Harlem goes to war. If he humiliates me and sends me home alive, Harlem falls in line without him firing a shot. So he will try to break me without killing me, and as long as he is trying to break me instead of bury me, I have a chance." Bumpy left the wine on the bar and walked out into the October night. The cold hit him like a slap. And somewhere down the street, a woman was yelling at someone in Spanish, her voice echoing off the brick buildings. A car drove past with a broken muffler, the engine noise rattling through the street like machine gun fire. 75 minutes until 9 o'clock. 75 minutes to walk into a room designed to make him look small and powerless and afraid. 75 minutes to figure out how to turn a trap into a stalemate. Because stalemate was the only win available when you walked into a game where the other side controlled all the pieces. Harlem did not know what was going to happen tonight, but Harlem knew that when Bumpy Johnson walked out of that bar, he was walking toward something that would either cement his reputation or bury it so deep that no one would remember his name a year from now. The order holding Harlem together was about to be tested with tire irons and threats, and the kind of violence that left scars even on people who were not in the room when it happened. And the only question left was whether Bumpy understood the game well enough to survive it. 8:40 at night, and Bumpy stood outside 173 East 3rd Street, looking at a building that did not advertise what happened inside. The Germania Club had no sign, no lights, just a door with 2 men standing in front of it like they were guarding the gates to hell. Both were German. Both were built like brick walls, and both looked at Bumpy the way you look at meat about to be ground up. The taller one had a scar running from his ear to his jaw, the kind that comes from a knife that almost found the throat. He looked Bumpy up and down and spoke with an accent thick as mud. "Name: Bumpy Johnson." The guard checked a clipboard like he was processing inmates. He found the name, made a mark, and stepped aside without another word. The door opened, and the smell that came out was cigar smoke and old wood, and something else that smelled like fear soaked into walls over years. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for two men to pass. The smoke hung thick enough to see it move when you breathed. The lights were yellow and dim, making skin look gray and eyes look hollow. Bumpy's shoes echoed on the wooden floor, each step counting down to something that had not started yet but was already inevitable. Somewhere deeper in the building, music played. A jazz band so distant it sounded underwater. The rhythm off just enough to make you think someone's heart was beating wrong. The guard led Bumpy to a door at the end of the hall. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. The door opened, and Bumpy stepped into a room where 15 men stood in a loose circle, all watching him like the show was about to start, and he was the main attraction. A man near the door, younger than the rest, with slicked-back hair and a suit that did not quite fit, grinned at Bumpy like he had just heard a joke nobody else got yet. "You must be the guy from Harlem, the one who thinks he can tell Mr. Schultz how things work." Bumpy looked at him without expression. "I am the guy from Harlem. Who are you?" The grin disappeared. "I am the guy who gets to watch what happens when people like you forget their place." "And what place is that?" "On your knees, begging Mr. Schultz not to do to you what we did to that clerk tonight. Have you heard about that? We broke every finger on both his hands. It took us 5 minutes. He screamed so loud people 3 floors up heard it. That is what happens when Mr. Schultz wants to send a message. Tonight, you are the message." Bumpy walked past him without responding and stopped in the center of the circle. Nobody shook his hand. Nobody spoke. The only sound was breathing and the distant jazz that sounded like it was coming from another world. An older man, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and eyes like chips of ice, stepped forward from the circle. He had the look of someone who had done terrible things for so long that they no longer registered as terrible, just as work that needed doing. "You know where you are." "I know." "You know what happens here." "I can guess." "Then you know that walking out of here depends entirely on how the next 20 minutes go. Mr. Schultz does not call people downtown to have friendly conversations. He calls them downtown to make examples. And tonight, you are the example." Bumpy's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed flat. If he wanted to make an example, he would have done it in Harlem where people could see. He called me here because he wants something. And whatever he wants, he thinks threatening me is how he gets it. The older man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You think you understand how this works. You think because you run some numbers in Harlem and people know your name that you have leverage. But leverage only works when both sides have something to lose. You have everything to lose. Mr. Schultz has nothing to lose. That is not leverage. That is just you standing in a room with 15 men who would break your neck if he told them to. And the only reason they have not done it yet is because he has not given the order. Then why am I still standing? Because Mr. Schultz wants you to understand something before you leave here tonight. He wants you to understand that Harlem belongs to him now. The banks, the numbers, the protection, all of it. And if you or St. Clair or anyone else in that neighborhood thinks they can operate without paying tribute, then what happened to that clerk tonight is just the beginning." Bumpy stood in the center of the circle and did not move. He did not look around nervously. He did not ask where Schultz was. He just stood there like a man waiting for something he had already calculated the odds on, and that stillness started to work on the men around him. One of the soldiers near the back, a thick guy with hands like hammers, leaned to the man next to him and whispered, "Why is he not scared? He should be scared." The other man shrugged. "Maybe he is stupid. Stupid people do not last long enough to run Harlem. He knows something we do not. The whispering spread through the circle like a crack through ice. Bumpy had walked into a trap designed to break him, and instead of breaking, he was standing there calm enough to make them wonder if the trap was working. Somewhere a clock ticked. Somewhere footsteps approached. Heavy and deliberate. The door opened, and Dutch Schultz walked in wearing a suit that cost more than most people in Harlem made in a year. He looked at Bumpy the way you look at a problem you are about to solve permanently. And when he spoke, his voice was cold and flat as a mortuary slab. "You made it. I was not sure you would be stupid enough to actually show up." Bumpy met his eyes without blinking. "You told me to be here, so I am here." Schultz walked a slow circle around Bumpy, close enough that Bumpy could smell the cologne and cigar smoke. "You know why you are here. You want to talk about Harlem. I want to talk about how Harlem is mine. How every dollar that changes hands up there belongs to me. How every bank, every number runner, every protection racket operates because I allow it to operate. And how if I decide tomorrow that I do not want you or St. Clair or anyone else running anything, then you stop running it. Not because I ask nicely, because I make it impossible for you to continue breathing." Bumpy's hands stayed in his pockets. "If you wanted me gone, I would be gone already. You brought me here to tell me something. So tell me." Schultz stopped circling and stood directly in front of him, close enough that Bumpy could see the veins in his neck pulsing. "I brought you here to watch what happens when people forget who runs this city." He turned to the circle of men and raised his hand, and from the back of the room, a shadow moved. The shadow was massive, easily 350 pounds, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway and hands that looked like they could crush a skull like an eggshell. People called him tiny because the world loves cruel jokes. And when he stepped into the light, every man in the room except Bumpy took a step back. Schultz smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had just played a card he knew could not be beaten. "This is Rocco. Rocco handles problems for me. And tonight, you are a problem." Schultz pulled a chair into the center of the circle and sat down like a judge taking the bench. Slow and deliberate, making sure everyone in the room understood that time moved at his pace and nobody else's. He lit a cigar with a gold lighter, and the sound of the flint striking was sharp and clear in the quiet room, like a stamp coming down on paper to make something official. He took a long pull on the cigar and let the smoke drift out slowly, then looked at Bumpy with eyes that had watched men beg and scream and die, and had stopped caring about the difference between those things a long time ago. "Let me tell you how this city works, since you seem confused about it. The police work for me. I pay them more than the city does, and they do what I tell them to do. The judges work for me. When I need a case to disappear, it disappears. When I need someone sent away, they get sent away. The politicians work for me because I fund their campaigns and they know what happens when they stop being useful." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the cigar held between two fingers like a teacher holding a piece of chalk before writing something on a board that students better remember. "Harlem is part of this city. That means Harlem works for me. Every number that gets run, I get a piece. Every bank that operates, I get a piece. Every business that wants to stay open, I get a piece. And if someone in Harlem thinks they can operate without paying me, then I send people to explain the new arrangement. Like I sent people to explain it to that clerk tonight. You hear what we did to him." Bumpy's face showed nothing. "I heard." "Good. Then you understand that when I call you downtown, you come, not because I am asking nicely, because I am telling you. Tonight you are here because I ordered you here, and you will leave when I allow you to leave. And between now and then, you are going to deliver a message to St. Clair that he can either pay what he owes or we will keep breaking his people until there is nobody left to run his operation. Schultz stood up and walked in a slow circle around Bumpy, the cigar smoke trailing behind him like a ghost. You are not here to negotiate. You are not here to make a deal. You are here to listen and nod and understand that your role in this is to be a messenger. That is all you are. A messenger. And messengers who forget their place end up delivering their last message with broken hands and no teeth. Bumpy did not turn to follow Schultz as he circled. He just stood there, hands still in his pockets, voice flat as concrete when he finally spoke. Harlem is not something you take just because you want it. The room went silent. Every man in the circle stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped doing anything except watching to see what would happen next. Schultz stopped walking and turned to face Bumpy, his expression somewhere between amused and annoyed, like a man who just heard a child say something stupid and was deciding whether to laugh or backhand the kid for wasting his time. What did you just say to me? I said Harlem is not something you take. It is not a wallet you can pick. It is not a store you can shake down. It is a neighborhood with its own order. And that order does not change just because you decide you want a bigger piece. Schultz's jaw tightened. You think I need your permission. You think I care about order. I made the order. I am the order. And if Harlem does not understand that yet, then we will keep teaching until the lesson sinks in. Bumpy's eyes stayed locked on Schultz. You can teach all you want, but understand something. Every move you make in Harlem costs you. Every time you hurt someone, you make more enemies. Every time you take something, you make people willing to lose everything to take it back. You think breaking a clerk's hands makes you powerful. All it does is show people you are willing to hurt them. And when people know you are willing to hurt them, they stop caring about staying safe. They start caring about making you pay. Schultz stepped closer. So close that Bumpy could smell the cigar smoke on his breath and see the vein pulsing in his temple. Are you threatening me? In my place with my people watching, I am telling you what happens next if you keep pushing. You want Harlem, you will get it. But it will cost you more than you think. And by the time you realize that, it will be too late to back out without looking weak. So you decide right now, do you want to make money, or do you want to prove a point, because proving a point is expensive, and I do not think you are as rich as you pretend to be. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or calculation. Schultz stared at Bumpy for a long time, and you could see the gears turning behind his eyes, weighing whether this man standing in front of him was brave or stupid or something worse, something that knew how to play a game Schultz had not seen coming. Then Schultz laughed, and it was not a real laugh. It was the sound a snake makes when it is about to strike. You have balls. I will give you that. Coming into my place and talking to me like you have leverage. But balls do not stop bullets. And they do not stop Rocco. He turned to the circle of men and raised his voice just enough that everyone could hear it clearly. You know what I hate most? I hate people who do not know their place. I hate when someone from Harlem thinks they can walk into Manhattan and talk to me like we are equals. We are not equals. I own cops. I own judges. I own politicians. What do you own? A few blocks and some loyalty from people too poor to matter. The men in the circle laughed on cue, and the laughter had edges like broken glass. Schultz took another pull on his cigar and looked at Bumpy with something that might have been pity, if pity were not too expensive an emotion for men like him to afford. You want to know why I brought you here? I brought you here to show you what happens when people forget where they stand. I brought you here so you can go back to Harlem and tell Saint, Claire, and everyone else who thinks they can operate without paying me that this is what it looks like when I stop being patient. He paused, let the words hang in the air, then delivered the line that was designed to cut deeper than any knife. People like you need to know their place, and your place is not at this table. Your place is not in this room. Your place is wherever I tell you it is. The air in the room changed. The temperature dropped. The men in the circle shifted their weight, sensing that something was about to happen that would either be entertainment or a warning, depending on whether they were smart enough to learn from it. Schultz did not need to say anything else. He just looked toward the back of the room and gave the smallest nod, barely more than a twitch of his chin. And that was all it took. Rocco stepped forward from the shadows where he had been standing, and the floorboards creaked under his weight like the building itself was protesting having to hold him up. He was massive, 350 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, with hands that looked like they could rip a phone book in half, and a face that suggested he had done worse things than that to people who had annoyed him less than Bumpy was annoying Schultz right now. He stopped 3 feet from Bumpy and looked down at him with eyes that showed about as much emotion as a hammer shows when it is about to hit a nail. Too small. I break you like dry wood. Schultz smiled and leaned back in his chair, the cigar between his teeth. Rocco is going to teach you a lesson about respect. And when he is done, you are going to crawl back to Harlem and tell everyone what happens when you forget who runs this city. 60 seconds. That was how much time was left before violence filled the room like water filling a sinking ship. 60 seconds for Bumpy to decide whether he was going to try to talk his way out of something that was already past the point where talking worked, or whether he was going to do what he came here to do, which was survive long enough to make Schultz regret calling him downtown in the first place. The circle opened like a mouth. The men stepped back in practiced formation, creating a ring with Bumpy and Rocco at the center, and the speed with which they moved suggested this was not the first time they had watched someone get broken in this room. Schultz leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs, the cigar still between his teeth, watching like a man who had paid for a show and was about to get his money's worth. Rocco cracked his knuckles one at a time, the sound like small bones breaking, then rolled his neck until it popped. He grinned at Bumpy, showing teeth that had been used to bite through cartilage more than once. One hand is enough. You are too small to need two. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and 2 men in the circle swallowed hard. Rocco was not just big. He was the kind of big that made physics a weapon. The young guy with slicked back hair leaned to the man next to him and whispered, "This is going to be over in 10 seconds. Less than that. Rocco is going to snap him like dry wood." Schultz raised his voice just loud enough that everyone could hear. "Rocco, try not to kill him. I want him alive enough to crawl back to Harlem and tell everyone what happens when they forget their place." Rocco nodded and stepped forward, closing the distance. His right arm came up fast, reaching for Bumpy's throat, the kind of grab that would lift a man off the ground and choke the life out of him before he could scream. The momentum he carried was enough to crush bone if it connected. Bumpy moved, not a big movement, just a rotation. 6 inches to the left, and Rocco's hand closed on empty air. The grab that should have ended everything grabbed nothing, and Rocco's weight carried him forward into space where Bumpy had been. "What the hell?" someone in the circle muttered. Bumpy struck. One short punch, precise, aimed at the soft spot below Rocco's ribs where the diaphragm controls breathing. Not designed to break bones, designed to make breathing stop. Rocco's face went white. His hands went to his chest, grasping for air that would not come. His knees buckled, and all 350 pounds of him went down. His right knee hit the floor with a sound like a hammer on wood, and the impact shook the room. "Get up," Schultz said, his voice sharp as a razor. "Rocco." "Get up." Rocco tried. His body would not respond. His lungs would not fill. He stayed there on one knee, one hand on the floor, gasping like a drowning man, and the sound of him fighting for air filled the silent room. The young guy with slicked hair stared, his mouth open. "That is not possible." "Nobody drops Rocco." The man next to him grabbed his arm. Shut your mouth. Do not move. Bumpy stepped back, giving Rocco space, and put his hands back in his pockets. His voice was calm, steady. I told you, Harlem is not something you take. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They all stood there watching Rocco try to stand and fail, watching 350 pounds of muscle that was supposed to be unstoppable reduced to a man who could not catch his breath. The myth of Rocco being unbeatable was dying right there on the floor in front of 15 witnesses, and everyone in that room understood what it meant. Schultz finally stood up, slowly, and walked to where Rocco was still kneeling. He looked down at his enforcer, the man who had never lost, the weapon that kept people afraid. Then he looked at Bumpy, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and cold. Get him up. Now. 2 men rushed forward and helped Rocco to his feet, but even standing, he looked like a building that had been hit and was not sure it could stay vertical. His breathing was coming back, shallow and painful. But coming back, Schultz turned away from Rocco like he had stopped existing and focused everything on Bumpy. You just made a mistake. Did I? You embarrassed me, in my place, in front of my people. You think that does not have consequences? Bumpy's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed flat. You called me here to make a point. I made one instead. Now we both know where we stand. One of the older men in the circle, the one with gray temples who had been watching everything with cold calculation, stepped forward and spoke to Schultz in a voice low enough that only those close could hear. Boss, if word gets out that Rocco went down, every crew from the Bronx to Brooklyn will think we are weak. We cannot let this walk. Schultz raised his hand, cutting him off. He stared at Bumpy for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, and you could see the mathematics happening behind his eyes. Kill Bumpy now, and Harlem goes to war. Let Bumpy walk. And the story spreads that someone from Harlem came downtown and put Rocco on his knees. Both options cost something. The question was, which cost less? Finally, Schultz spoke, and every word was measured like it was being carved into stone. Get out. Bumpy did not move immediately. We done here. We are done, for now. But understand something. What happened here tonight does not leave this room. Not one word. Not from you. Not from anyone. Because if I hear that people in Harlem are talking about how you put Rocco down, then I will come up there and burn every building you care about until there is nothing left but ash and memory. Are we clear? Bumpy looked at him, then at Rocco, who was still breathing hard and looking at the floor like he could not believe what had just happened. Clear. Then get out before I change my mind. Bumpy walked toward the door. The circle parted to let him through, and nobody tried to stop him. Nobody even looked at him directly. He walked out of that room the same way he walked in, calm and steady. And when the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was heavier than any shouting could have been. Schultz stood there for a long moment, then turned to the circle of men, and his voice was low and dangerous. What happened here tonight stays here. Rocco slipped. That is the story. Anyone who says different ends up in the river. Understood. Yes, boss. Understood. Yes, boss. Schultz looked at Rocco, who was finally standing on his own, but still looked like he had been hit by a truck. You let a man half your size put you on the floor. How does that happen? Rocco's voice came out rough, like gravel being dragged across metal. He knew where to hit. I have never seen anyone move like that. I do not care how he moved. You are supposed to be unbeatable. That is what I pay you for. That is why people are afraid to cross me. And tonight, in front of 15 witnesses, you went down like a sack of bricks. Do you understand what that does to my reputation? Rocco's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. It will not happen again. It better not, because if it does, you will not be working for me anymore. You will be working for whoever finds your body and needs someone to dig a hole big enough to fit it. Schultz turned away and walked back to his chair, picking up his cigar from where it had been resting in an ashtray. He took a long pull and let the smoke out slowly. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less dangerous. That man just walked into my place, put my best enforcer on the floor, and walked out alive. And the only reason I let him walk is because killing him would have cost me more than letting him live. But make no mistake, this is not over. Harlem thinks they won something tonight. They did not win. They just bought themselves time, and time runs out for everyone. Schultz stood in the center of the room and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of a death sentence. Nobody talks about what happened here tonight. Not one word. Not to your friends. Not to your wives. Not even to yourselves. What happened here stays here. Forever. The men in the circle nodded, but Schultz was not done. He walked slowly, looking each man in the eyes, making sure they understood this was not a suggestion. This was survival. You think I am worried about my pride? I care about what happens when the Bronx hears about it. When Brooklyn hears. When every small-time operator with a gun decides that maybe Dutch Schultz is not as untouchable as they thought. You understand what happens to bosses who look weak. They get replaced. Not by votes. They get replaced by bullets in the back of the head and bodies that wash up in the river 3 days later. He stopped in front of the young guy with slicked back hair. So when you leave here tonight, you forget what you saw. Rocco slipped. That is the story. And if I hear anything different, the person who talked becomes an example of what happens when you cannot keep your mouth shut. Are we clear? Yes, boss. Schultz looked at Bumpy. You heard what I said. This stays quiet. You go back to Harlem and you do not brag. You do not tell St. Clair how you put Rocco down, because the moment you start talking, I will come to Harlem and burn it until there is nothing left but ash. You understand me? Bumpy looked at him, his voice steady. I understand. Then get out. Silence keeps you alive. Pride gets you buried. Bumpy walked out into the October night. The street was empty except for a drunk sleeping against a building. He walked 3 blocks before he stopped and leaned against a wall, letting out a breath he had been holding since Rocco went down. He understood what Schultz was doing, protecting his reputation by burying the story, and Bumpy was protecting Harlem by keeping it buried. If word got out, Schultz would have to retaliate to save face, and retaliation meant war. And war meant people in Harlem getting hurt who had nothing to do with this. So Bumpy would stay quiet. Not because Schultz told him to, because staying quiet was the smart play. The move that let him win without turning the win into a disaster. The consequences of that night spread slowly, like cracks through ice. Schultz did not pull out of Harlem, but he stopped pushing as hard. The attacks on St. Clair's operations slowed. The demands for tribute got quieter. The violence dropped to levels that were uncomfortable but manageable. It was not a retreat. It was a recalculation. A decision that Harlem was not worth the cost of taking by force when it might make him look weak in front of other families who were always watching. The men who had been in that room started acting differently. Some avoided going to Harlem for collections, sending junior guys instead. Some got more careful about who they threatened. Some just got quieter, like they were carrying weight they could not put down. Rocco was still alive, still working for Schultz, but he was not the same. He stopped leading the big jobs, the ones that required walking into rooms and making everyone afraid. He started doing smaller work, collections from people too scared to fight back. He did not talk much anymore. He avoided eye contact, and nobody mentioned what had happened, but everyone remembered. 3 weeks later, one of Schultz's lieutenants was in a bar in the Bronx when someone asked why Schultz had backed off Harlem so suddenly. The lieutenant had been there that night. He had seen Rocco go down. He had heard the order to stay silent, and he knew answering truthfully would get him killed. So he lied. Schultz decided Harlem was not worth the trouble. Too much heat from the cops. He is focusing on Brooklyn instead. The man nodded and bought him a drink, and the lie became the official story. Schultz kept his reputation. Bumpy kept Harlem from burning. And the truth stayed locked in a room on East 3rd Street, where 15 men had watched something impossible become real, and then agreed to pretend it never happened. That was the law of silence. Not honor. Not loyalty. Just survival dressed up as discretion. And in the world these men lived in, survival was the only currency that mattered. The war did not end that night, but that night changed the rhythm of the war. Schultz did not pull out of Harlem completely, because pulling out would look like retreat. And retreat would make him look weak to every other family watching for signs that his grip was slipping. But he stopped pushing as hard. He stopped making examples. He took the long way around problems instead of going through them with tire irons and threats. Saint. Claire got breathing room. The attacks on his operation slowed down. The clerks stopped getting their fingers broken. The tribute demands got quieter. And Harlem understood something without anyone having to say it out loud. Sometimes one punch at the right moment is enough to pull an entire community back from the edge of being swallowed whole. Bumpy Johnson's position in Harlem grew stronger in the silence that followed. Nobody talked about what happened at the Germania Club, but people felt the change. The pressure eased, the violence dropped, and Bumpy did not need credit or medals or stories told about him in bars. He just needed the order to hold. And the order held. Dutch Schultz kept his reputation outside Harlem because the law of silence protected him. But from that night forward, he had to factor in a new variable every time he made a move. Harlem was not as easy to break as he thought. Harlem had someone willing to walk into a room full of enemies and walk out alive. And that made every future calculation more complicated. Rocco lived. He kept working for Schultz. But the myth of him being unbeatable died on the floor of that back room. The organization still used him for collections and intimidation. But they stopped putting him in situations where he might have to prove he was still the monster everyone thought he was. He became scenery instead of the main event. And that demotion was never spoken, but always understood. The men who witnessed it changed too. Some of them pulled back from the big jobs and started working smaller operations where the stakes were lower and the risks were manageable. Some of them stopped believing in the idea that size and reputation made you invincible. They had seen proof that sometimes a smaller man with better timing could put a giant on his knees. And that proof changed how they thought about power. The new order that emerged from that night was not written in contracts or sealed with handshakes or enforced with guns. It was written in a moment. 5 seconds, when physics and timing and nerve converged to create an outcome that nobody expected and everyone had to live with. Real power did not come from being the biggest or the meanest or the one with the most guns. Real power came from intelligence, from discipline, from knowing when to strike and when to walk away. It came from understanding that sometimes the best move was to let your opponent defeat himself by being so afraid of losing his reputation that he stopped taking the risks that built the reputation in the first place. Schultz was still dangerous. Harlem was still under pressure. But the balance had shifted just enough that survival became possible. And in a world where most people did not survive, possible was the same as winning. That was the lesson of October 12th, 1934. Not that violence could be avoided, not that the strong could be beaten by being right, just that sometimes, if you were smart enough and fast enough and calm enough, you could walk into a trap and turn it into a stalemate, And stalemate was the only victory available to people who did not have armies. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy. It is what you choose to build.